Hi everyone. I'm going to walk you through an example of a shift in the supply curve. So you can see, first of all, the supply and demand model, how we need both to determine price and quantity in the market, and to show you an example of when one of those curves would shift and show you how that leads to a shift along the other curve. So in layman's terms, demand and quantity demanded probably seem like the same thing, how much of something is demanded. But in econ, we have to differentiate between the whole curve, which you see in this first graph here, and between how much is demanded at a specific price. So the demand is the whole curve. So when an economist says the demand for, in this case, hamburgers, they talk about everyone's preferences and the price they're willing to pay for different quantities. So the higher the price is, the fewer hamburgers people demand in general, and that's true for almost every good. It's true for all normal goods. And so the lower the price gets, the more people are going to buy. So that's why we see a downward sloping demand curve. So when you hear the term demand, think of the entire line, the whole set of price and quantity combinations that people will use depending on what the market is. So if you want to talk about how much people are buying or demanding, that's quantity demanded. So we'll see, you read in chapter 3 the difference between that, and we'll show the difference between that in the curves and in the model here. So let's imagine this demand for hamburgers. This is just, some made up numbers from me, but so we see at, $25, about 1,000 hamburgers are demanded. That's the quantity demanded at that price. And at about $10, we see, if you were to look at the graph below, it would be about 7,800 hamburgers demanded. And at $5, we get to at $5 per hamburger, people are buying 10,000 hamburgers. That's the quantity demanded at that price. And so it would look something like this. So you see we have our downward sloping demand curve. At 25, here's the about 1,000. At $10, we're a little before 8,000, so we're going to say about 7,800. And then at 5, it's about 10,000. So it's sloping down, and we notice that we don't know how many hamburgers are demanded by people, and we don't know the price. We only know the different combinations. To get a price in a quantity demanded, we need a supply curve. So the supply curve works the same way. It represents the quantities that suppliers will provide at each price point. So, if you knew that you could sell a hamburger for $100 each, you might consider going into the hamburger market. And if that were the case, lots and lots of hamburgers would be supplied because businesses would want to supply more of them because their profits would be higher. So that's why you see an upward sloping demand curve. The lower the price of a hamburger, the less interested businesses are in selling that item. Their profits are shrinking, so that's signaling to them that less needs to be produced. So that's why you see this this opposite relationship that we have with demand. The lower the price, the lower the quantities supplied. So it's the opposite of what we see with demand. So given everything as is, these are the price and quantity combinations that people demand and that suppliers supply. That's what these two curves show us. And where the curves meet is where we determine our price and our quantity. So you'll see that point is right here, where both consumers and suppliers are happy. So that's at about $10 a hamburger. These are very, very good hamburgers, apparently. And so the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied will be 7,800. If the price were any lower, so if the price were $5, there would not be enough supplied. So quantity supplied, which is where we meet our supply curve, would be, a little over 4,000, but people would demand, nearly 10,000. At 5, they would demand nearly 10,000 hamburgers. So that would create a problem. You might see really long lines at burger places, and then they'd run out of hamburgers because people were flooding them because they think, wow, this is such a great deal. And suppliers don't want to supply more at that price because they won't make enough money. So if the price were any higher, let's say it were $15, people would only be interested in buying a little over 5,000 hamburgers. It's kind of a high price for them, and that's how much they're willing to buy at that price. But suppliers at this price, they would like to sell a lot because they're making more profit at this point. So, they're aiming to sell about 11,000. So the disconnect between how much people are demanding and how much businesses are supplying will create a surplus. So these hamburger places would have too many hamburgers. They'd be throwing away a lot of hamburgers at the end of every day because not enough people are buying them. So anytime you're at a surplus or a shortage, that signals that the price has to change so that the consumers and the suppliers can be aligned and come back to this equilibrium point. So we see again that equilibrium is $10 and 7,800 hamburgers. Now let's see what happens when something changes. Now, let's imagine that one of the major suppliers for hamburgers is shut down for major health violations and can no longer produce hamburgers. If this were like McDonald's and Burger King, Wendy's, we could imagine, let's say that Burger King goes out of business because, they find something very disturbing about some health violations and all of the Burger Kings are shut down. In the immediate run, so the next day, Wendy's and McDonald's, they can't just automatically make more hamburgers. So we see that the supply curve will have to be less. The supply of hamburgers has to decrease because there are less suppliers now. And in the immediate run, we can't just have the other operators ramp up immediately. So we see that the entire supply curve will shift inward, at least for the time being. So we see us move from S1 to S2. There's fewer suppliers, and that's one of the things that can shift the entire supply curve. And now we know that we'll have a new equilibrium point as well, because we know that equilibrium is where supply and demand meet, but that's in a new place now that we have a new supply curve. So this is our new equilibrium point, and it looks like it's about $11 for the new equilibrium price, and the quantity will be about, at this point, about a little over 7,000. And the demand curve in this case doesn't change. Remember, demand builds into it every single price that people are willing to pay. All that has to change is the quantity demanded. So we just moved from this point on the demand curve up to this point on the demand curve. And then here are some other examples of what might shift the entire curve. A population increase will shift the demand curve outward. There are more people demanding things, so that shifts everything out. In this case with the hamburgers, if the cost of beef goes up, then that will shift the supply of hamburgers inward again. When input costs go up, that increases that decreases the supply curve. Suppliers just can't make as much profit, so they can't produce as much. Discovery of a new oil reserve would shift the oil supply curve outward. That's the opposite of what we saw in this example, where there was a decrease in the number of suppliers. Now there's more supply, so we'll see that move out, and that will create a decrease in price. And let's say research comes out linking soda to cancer. People would read this and they might think, gee, I don't want to drink as much soda as I did before. So that's going to affect the demand curve, the entire thing. At every price point, people are willing to buy less than they were before, given this information. So I want you to think about this in terms of your company. Everyone's doing a different company for the most part. There's a really great range. So think about, from a supply side, the inputs that go into it and how the availability of those inputs has maybe changed over time. And from the demand side, how are people feeling about the demand for your product? Or are they wanting more of it as time goes on? Have there been any changes in what they're demanding as far as products go? So with the soda example, when diets were a big fad, diet soda became more popular. Now that people don't want as much high fructose corn syrup in their diets, we might see more non-sugary beverages coming out of those companies. So that's how demand and supply shifts apply to your company specifically. So start to think about that as you read this chapter and do some of the practice problems.